If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. Do you have any stories or experiences regarding portals in the woods or forests, 411 incidents, time slips on trails or deep forests, or creatures that abduct people in the forests? I live in an 800-plus acre forest comprised mostly of research property owned by the University of Michigan. The property is crisscrossed by trails that are open to the public, and for as long as I can remember, I've spent a good deal of my free time at home exploring on and off the paths. I know the woods like the back of my hand, and I have always felt safe and at home in them. In the fall of 2016, I came home from college for a weekend to see my girlfriend at the time. The weather was nice, and that Saturday afternoon we decided to take a walk. There is a service road that runs up the center of the forest, providing access to a few small university properties. This was where we chose to take our walk. Towards the end of the road, the terrain on one side of the path slopes down into a bowl-like depression. This was where my girlfriend and I parted ways. I went down into the crater to snap some photos with my camera, and she went off the path in the other direction, investigating piles of field stones that had been left between the trees when the road was first laid years ago. I was down in the crater for maybe 3 minutes when I heard her call out from above me. I quickly climbed back up and found her on the same side of the path as me, jogging through the trees towards a thicker part of the woods. She looked genuinely shocked when she saw me and stopped dead in her tracks. She explained that while she was walking towards the crater to join me, she saw me standing in the path waiting for her. From her description, I was grinning playfully, and when she got close, I dashed away, teasing her as I ran deeper into the woods. She says I was wearing the same blue jacket, the same Aztec camera strap, and the same gray beanie. My face was unmistakable as well. I never saw this rascal with my own eyes, so naturally I'm pretty skeptical, but she seemed genuinely shaken, and to this day she stands by her story. I'm uncomfortable walking in the forest alone now, and I can't help but wonder where that girl would have ended up had she followed my lookalike on his jog through the woods. I was walking down this gravel road about a mile from my dad's house, and there were cows on one side and a few houses intermittently on the other side. As I came to the bend, it's a U-shaped road, I noticed in the woods off to the left a tinier gravel road, and it had a little metal sign. It was all corroded and old, but it said Apple Grove Cemetery. So I walked down about a quarter mile, and there was an old cemetery with the cement-encased graves they have here in Louisiana. Some were raised, and some were low. The oldest grave I saw was in 1820, and the most recent was in 1938. Some of the stones had pictures in them, and they looked relatively clean and well maintained. Off behind the graveyard was a short iron fence with a gate and a walkway up to a little stone house that seemed to have lights on inside the windows. It was starting to get dark, so I decided to head back and come back the next day with my niece and my 2 sons. I knew they'd love to see this place. The next day we went back, and the gravel walkway was much more overgrown and hard to see, and the sign was no longer there. The graveyard itself was all broken and decrepit, you could barely read any of them or see the pictures on them. It was all very different than it was the evening before. Much older and neglected. And the iron fence was barely noticeable, it was only being held up by the brambles of bushes and vines that intertwined it, and the house was half collapsed on one side with all the doors and windows boarded up, and the walkway was non-existent. I was really creeped out, and I couldn't even explain it to my niece or my boys because they were just kids. I did go back to that cemetery a handful of times since, and it's never been as it was that first time I went down there. This is the craziest UFO phenomenon true story, and it came from my dad. In the 1960s in Ethiopia, my dad was just a child, 9 years old, at the time, playing with his best friend Gabriel after school. They were playing in the fenced backyard of my dad's house. My dad turns his back for a second, then turns to look back at his friend, and Gabriel is gone. It's important to note that my dad and Gabriel were from the top 1% of Ethiopia's ruling elite. My dad's father was Minister of Interior of Ethiopia, and Gabriel's father was a 4-star general of Ethiopia. The backyard Gabriel disappeared from had 10-foot-high brick walls with armed guards patrolling on the outside. A couple of hours pass, and his parents, my dad's parents, and guards are searching, but no Gabriel. 48 hours have passed, and now there is a nationwide search for this important general's kid. It's on the news, and police are searching door to door, describing him and what he was wearing when he disappeared. He was wearing his private school uniform, a white shirt, and brown pants. Helicopters even searched the countryside looking for him, but still nothing. A month passes, then 2, then 4, and people start losing hope that he will ever be found and think the worst. Exactly 6 months after the day he disappeared, Gabriel appears back in my dad's backyard. He was wearing the same white shirt as his private school uniform, and it was still clean. He looked exactly the same as when he disappeared. This is where it starts to get weird. Once they confirmed he was okay, they started asking where he had been. He said a couple of nice men took him on a trip. He was in a white room that glowed, and other children were there from different countries. He said he was surprised that the nice men who looked like white guys could speak Ethiopian, and he could understand what the other children were saying even though they were not Ethiopian. The white, glowing room had no windows, and the doors disappeared into the walls. There were buttons on the walls, and if a kid pushed them, a bed would come out of the wall. He said he was then, all of a sudden, in a city that was glowing and clean, and cars were flying around him. He said there were people there, but they looked strange, like us but different. One nice man was still with him and took him to a tall building, where he said he had to stay there for a while but showed him a room that he could use for entertainment. Gabriel said he could push a button, and the room itself goes places, an open field, the beach, the room itself even flies. He said that after a couple of hours, he was taken back to Ethiopia and appeared in the backyard. He thought he was only gone for a couple of hours total. No one believed him, and Ethiopia being a super religious country, most adults around him thought he was possessed by the devil. Gabriel was even forced to see a priest to get the evil spirits out of him. My dad still kept in contact with him throughout their lives. Gabriel got a doctorate in physics, and I believe he works in Holland still. Just a quick note. Below is the experience I had 2 days ago. I'm going back to the site right now. So if I disappear, people will have the details. I was in the woods trying to record footage for my channel on YouTube, Doug Shoe Bushcraft. I got some work done, but there were prop planes and helicopters flying overhead. I didn't want a lot of that in the audio because it can ruin the relaxing atmosphere. So in the late afternoon, I started hiking back. I made it to a logging road near my truck. There was a beautiful spot by a creek, so I stopped to video record. I heard, and felt, the stomping of something larger than a moose. I didn't see anything stomping. I'm saying that it sounded and felt that way, like when an angry moose stomps. But this was something heavier. But what could be heavier than a moose? It seems impossible for New Hampshire. The camera was acting up. When I got back home and played back the video footage, there was weird static on it. I thought I might have some video footage of the creek. I wasn't sure, but in any case, I was giving up on it. I started walking back to my truck, which wasn't far from there. I heard more stomping. Then I heard crashing. Something apparently breaking branches or saplings. I started video recording, saying something was in there. I heard a helicopter approaching. It flew right over the spot of the stomping or crashing and directly over me. Then I hear a lot of crashing, like something huge running fast right toward me. I start walking backward, then turn and run to my truck. I get into the truck, make a U-turn, and drive away as fast as I thought I could without getting stuck or breaking my truck. I couldn't see anything following me. Playing back the video, I couldn't hear the stomping. That was expected. I also couldn't hear the crash. I thought I would be able to. But it was some distance away, over the lip of a small ridge. I don't know if the audio can be enhanced. I'm going back now. There are marshy and muddy areas there. I'm hoping for footprints. I'll see if there is any other evidence. This didn't feel natural. I don't know how to explain it. I believe there are spiritual creatures that can cause fear and other powerful emotions. I think that's what this was. But we'll see. Update. I walked in and over the lip of the ridge. There were hundreds of saplings that had been knocked down, some old and some new. I found a tree that had been knocked over very recently. I know this because it has pinned down saplings with green leaves. Near that was a quartz crystal boulder dug out of the ground and a smaller quartz crystal rock. There were well-defined trails stomped down. The effect of all those saplings being knocked down made for very open woods in New Hampshire. In most wild areas, there is a lot of brush. I heard stomping in another area. I walked up on a ridge, continuing in the direction from which I had heard noise 2 days ago. This time the noise was in the opposite direction, down in a marsh. The trip was cut short by a storm that came out of nowhere, rain, high winds, and felt like a thunderstorm coming in. I noted trees that looked like they had been hit by lightning. I decided it was too dangerous and headed back. This happened 6 years ago. We moved to a new town, and our neighborhood is set in a wooded area, and there is a county park that backs up to it. About a half mile from our house, there is a nature center that has several very easy trails. Many younger school groups come here to learn stuff and go on easy hikes. My son, who at the time was 3, and I walked from our house up to the nature center to go for a hike. We were there for about what seemed like 30 minutes, but when we got home, we had been gone for over 2 hours. The trail we were on is like a large bowl. When you are standing up, you can see almost the whole trail. We had gone down into the bottom of the bowl, and as we were walking, I just started to feel strange. There was no one else around that I could see, but I kept having this feeling like someone was watching or following us. The park is not too far from a main road, and you can hear cars and motorcycles going by all the time. But at that moment, things were completely silent, and also strange was that there was no wildlife around. Normally, there were tons of squirrels, deer, and birds, but there was nothing. We get about 3/4 of the way around the trail, and my son says he wants to go up a set of stairs for me to go on the trail, and we will meet up. We have been here over 20 times, and up top are just open fields where they have soccer fields, so I'm like, okay, go for it, even though to myself I'm just not feeling normal. I let him go and hustled around to meet him. It probably should have taken less than a minute for us to meet. I get up there, and he is nowhere to be found. At first, I was like, oh, he just went back down the stairs, playing around, no big deal. But as I start getting closer to the stairs, he is still not anywhere. I can't see him, so I go down the stairs again, thinking he followed my path, but nope, nothing. So now my heart rate is starting to climb, and I'm calling out for him. This makes no sense. The fields are wide open and way too big for a 3-year-old to make it across without me seeing him. So I am up top, and like I said, you can basically see the whole bowl where the trail is, but he is nowhere. I go back down and start backtracking, still calling out, and now I'm just about in full panic mode. The same thought just keeps going through my head, which is that this doesn't make any sense. There was nowhere for him to go that quickly. I'm now running up and down calling out for him, and I get to the top of the bowl, where I scream out his name. All the way across the field, at the very entrance of the trail, a lady yells out to me and says he is over here. What? How? No ducking way. It isn't a large area, but from that point to where we were, it takes 10 to 15 minutes to hike, and he had only been gone for 5 minutes. He felt longer, but it wasn't. I ran to him, and he seemed fine, and when I asked how he got over there, he said he heard me calling to him, which totally freaked me out. To this day, none of this makes sense to me. It's a small area, but I still have no idea how he got to that spot. We do go there still, but to say the least, I've never let him out of my sight. I grew up in a small town in Michigan, right next to a Native American reservation. The town even has an old Indian school that has been turned into an insane asylum. Finding old relics of the Native American population was relatively common, but this event is something I cannot explain and hardly ever talk about. I usually tell this story in 2 parts, not because I know they're related, but because it was freaking weird and feels incomplete to leave out. In the middle of a beautiful spring day, I took my golden retriever out for a walk in the woods behind our house. We walked for only about 5 minutes when I saw shadows moving quickly in my periphery. I look up to see a beautiful and large gray wolf lift its head to stare back at me, not 50 yards away. Nervous, I slowly back my distracted dog and I onto the main path, then book it up a hill to walk along the edge of the woods back to our house. I have some adrenaline going on at this point, but the neighbor's house is close, so I'm not as scared. I stop. There's a noise. A very out of place drumming noise. I've visited enough powwows to know that beat. I've heard it called the heartbeat of the earth because it sounds like a drum following a quick, even heartbeat. I look towards the neighbor's house on the left to see if they're just listening to music, but the house seems empty, and the sound is loud and clearly coming from the woods to my right. The trees are still bare from the winter, so I can see behind bushes and down an empty slope of woods. My dog is dead still with ears perked up, listening too. Shaking it off, I take a step forward, and the drums immediately stop. Weird. I have to be sure. Take a step backward, and there are the drums again, just as loud as before. At this point, my dog panics and bolts, rips the leash out of my hands, and runs for home with me on his heels. The woods in town are known for spooky events. And the house we lived in was full of odd experiences, but never anything like this, and I have never heard anything like it since. Please tell me, what was that? When I was about 8 or 9 years old, I was hanging out with my younger brother, 5 or 6 years old at the time, and a friend who was my age. It was an overcast day, and the clouds were so dense that the sky appeared entirely gray and without definition. Additionally, there was a very dense layer of fog, lying almost low enough to obscure the grass. We thought it would be fun to walk across the street into my neighbor's yard, as it is uphill and might provide an interesting vantage point for the fog. Twilight was setting in, so we dashed up the hill and partially into their backyard. The house was slightly angled in relation to the road. This was 1995, and in the suburb I grew up in, kids traipsing through random yards was normal. We ascended the hill and were met with what I have to think was another time. Certainly another place. The normally open grassy backyard was oddly clear of fog once we approached it, and within was something out of the Garden of Eden, which was my odd childhood interpretation of what, as an adult, I describe as a Romanesque style walking garden. There were exotic plants in large stone or ceramic vases, several rows of hedges and large stone walkways throughout the small garden, and a large stone fountain. None of the three of us described experiencing any specific feelings other than shock or surprise at a sight we knew was not there yesterday, and a deep, unshakable, and hard to describe thought that this was not our world. We turned tail, running back down the hill after only perhaps 3 to 5 seconds of observation, which unfortunately leaves me with very little description of the area. The next day, the fog cleared, and just to be certain, we approached the hill with trepidation, needing to confirm what exactly was in their yard. The backyard appeared as it had always appeared prior to the foggy day. A grill was set up along the backside of the house, a small swing set was set against the edge of the property, and nothing else. No stone walking paths, no fountain, etc. My brother confirms remembering this event, and unfortunately, my other companion has since passed. As a pretty hard-nosed skeptic, my best explanation that doesn't involve time displacement, multiple dimensions, or whatever other explanations I have heard after telling the tale is that I must have had a very elaborate, very vivid dream. As for my brother's recollection, it is not out of the realm of reason that I explained the dream in explicit detail to my younger brother upon awaking, and at his young age, he came to incorporate my retelling as his own memory. Frankly, I have no idea what the truth of the situation is, but it's the closest thing to a genuine unknown encounter, other than the shadow people that show up in night terrors. Duck those guys, they are just in our heads. Has anyone here ever seen white or bluish dots that flash or pulse closer to the ground? My husband and I experienced them last night. A rural part of Oklahoma is close to a river around 10 p.m. This was the night of the 2024 solar eclipse. All the flashes we saw seemed to be 20 to 40 yards away from us. Maybe up to 3 stories high at some times, but most of the time a couple of yards off the ground. Most of the flashes were white or blue, but a few throughout this experience were of a yellowish-orange color. At first, it was singular flashes or pulses, and they would flash in front of us or to the sides as well. All of them seemed to stick close to trees or tree lines. They appeared to be more active when we spoke directly to them, either vocally or mentally. We observed this for almost an hour before going inside. After about 5 or 10 minutes, we went back outside to see if the flashes were still occurring. They were. This time, though, some of the flashes were pulsing 2 to 3 times. It's almost as if some form of code exists. This went on for about 20 to 30 minutes with a mix of singular and multiple flashes or pulses before we went inside to go to bed as a pretty intense thunderstorm was approaching. Before we retired to bed, I tried to film them, but it was much too dark for my phone to pick up anything. These were not lighting bugs, it was much too early for them, and the lights were not yellow or green. They also did not move like bugs do. It looked like stars had fallen into the forest. But there was a big thunderstorm with cloud coverage, and the stars could not be seen that night. I live in a rural area of southwestern Ontario and have lived here all my life. There's about 5 or 6 closely knit farm towns in the county, all centering around the one I currently live in. This one is less of a farm town and more known for its relationship with the beginning of the oil industry. I'd name it, but the population is small, and I'd rather not share many identifying factors. Quite a few weird things have happened to me during my life here, but this one takes a big chunk of the cake. The street I currently live on extends fairly far from the town center to the fields outside of town. About 3/4 down that street from my apartment is a clearing that takes you down to a creek where rainwater drains. In high school, I was a bit of a shady kid, smoking pot in the woods with friends and all that good stuff. One day, while walking with my cousin and his friend, they decided we should sneak down to the drainage pipe and sit on the rocks to smoke. It was roughly 9:30 p.m., and I'd like to say it was June. Forgive me for not remembering clearly, this was about 6 years ago now, so it was just starting to get dark. I figured whatever nobody was going to see was better than doing nothing and following them down. On the way down the hill towards the creek, my cousin's friend pointed out a random chair placed in some bushes. It was old, like the 1970s era, with the flower-printed vinyl seat and metal frame. It definitely looked weird in that setting. It felt like we'd only been there for 2 minutes when it was suddenly completely dark, and I got a very sudden, uneasy feeling. One of those I should probably get the duck out of here feelings. I started telling them I wanted to go, but they insisted on taking one more toke each. I passed on any more in case it was just the weed making me paranoid, but soon enough I'd learn it wasn't just me. They finally finished up, dumped their bong, packed everything up, and we started heading back to the clearing exit. It seemed extremely, eerily quiet. despite having a drainage pipe gushing water exactly where we had been sitting. We'd only been walking for about a minute when I heard my cousin whisper, "What the?" and stop walking, so out of curiosity, I turned around. I regretted that instantly. Some abnormally tall figure was standing directly behind the chair I mentioned earlier, but it wasn't like your plain old spooky tall hooded guy. It was more creepy and lanky, like straight out of a horror flick. It didn't move whatsoever, but apparently all three of us had the same thought and just took off, running towards the clearing. I tripped on something, but it was too dark to see what. Thankfully, my cousin heard me trip and wasn't selfish enough to just abandon me there while he GTFO'd. He pulled me to my feet aggressively while telling me not to turn around, and he just kept dragging me towards the exit. Once we got back to proper civilization, I felt 100% safer for about 2 minutes. About a block away from the clearing, we stopped to catch our breath in front of some houses and streetlights, since if some shithead was just screwing with us in the woods, he obviously wouldn't continue antagonizing us if people could catch him. That was when we decided to look back, for whatever dumb ducking reason, and see what looked like the same lanky thing standing a few feet behind the street lamp nearest the clearing. It was almost ethereal, like the light didn't shine through it, but it also cast no shadows. We took off, running downtown to the main street, and a wave of relief washed over the three of us. I had them walk me home since I was scared shitless, but that really wasn't the end of it. I couldn't sleep at all that night, not without borrowing some, very low dosage, Xanax from my grandmother. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I had to close all the curtains and blinds in the house because I was so afraid of seeing that figure outside of my own home, and that anxiety haunted me for months afterwards. I don't think I was just seeing things that night, and I genuinely feel like if my cousin hadn't noticed me fall, I might not even have lived to tell this. I told my family that someone had followed us, rather than trying to explain how non-human they seemed. I feel like nobody would believe me anyway, and they'd assume it was just me being a dumb stoner making up stories to spook people. I've been properly stalked by someone before, and it was nothing like whatever the hell happened there that night. I'm just really glad I wasn't alone. On August 11th of last year, 2015, my grandparents and I drove from where they live in Washington state about 200 miles into the desert to watch a meteor shower. We found a windmill farm that was nice and dark, by a small field of overgrown grass or weed. It was about midnight now, so who knows. So we're there, and I'm lying on the grass watching the stars, watching some strange object, not a satellite, not a space station, not a plane, not a helicopter. I'm well familiar with all of the above, and both the size, light patterns, and flight patterns of this thing were completely unfamiliar. It also split into 6 smaller lights after spiraling around, and then reformed itself a couple of minutes later, when my grandfather's dog, a trained guard dog for his PTSD, supposed to warn him of anything dangerous, starts whimpering as we hear howling in the distance. My grandparents mutter speculatively about the origin of the howling, saying it's not dogs or coyotes. Now, because they've both been known to be a little too into the paranormal, I ignored them. So we're in this field for about 30 minutes, and I'm having a lovely time until I see something scuttling across the field towards us. It's hunched and dark, and it has the inverted knees of an animal. It's about 5 feet 6 inches and seems to be pacing around us in the field. The dog at this point starts going mad, but we drove so far to get here that I didn't say anything about the creature, knowing my grandparents would immediately abandon our field. After a while, the dog started tracking 5 or 6 of these creatures out in the field and was losing the ability to keep them all where he could see him. My grandparents noticed, and we had to leave. So now, I'm very mad and disappointed because we really only spent 30 to 40 minutes watching the shower, which was the whole point, so I asked my grandparents if we can pull over further along the road and keep watching. As I look back for a place for us to turn around and pull in, I see 2 glowing red eyes just behind our taillights, booking it after us. It ran hunched over, but it was the same creature from the field. Needless to say, I didn't insist we pull over. We drove for about 2 hours before the sun began coming up. At that point, we realized that we were still about 3 hours away from home, and it was already 5 a.m. but we had just left the field. You'll remember we arrived around midnight and only spent a maximum of 30 to 40 minutes there. So what the duck happened to the 4 hours? None of us remember. This happened 6 years ago. My wife and I just got out of college and didn't know what to do outside of looking for jobs. One day we were bored, so I drove us to a local butterfly sanctuary. It was the first time I'd been there in years, and I didn't notice a forest trail was open to the public. We decided to try it out, and it was relaxing. The loud noises of the city were gone. We met a few other people on the trail at first and even passed by a forest adventure-themed park near the entrance. After a few minutes of walking, it started getting foggy. I saw two young pine trees on each side of the trail bending towards each other, creating an arch. I jokingly commented to my wife that we might be walking to Silent Hill. She just chuckled, and we continued on. It was getting a bit worrying. We've been walking for around 2.5 hours already, and the trail just continued straight as a highway, seemingly with no end and no other people in sight. Finally, a huge boulder stuck on one side of the trail broke the monotony. It was enormous. We had to slowly walk around sideways while hugging it, or else we'd fall off the ravine on the other side of the path. The trail continued on for another 2.5 hours. We met my sister-in-law a few days after that and told her about our experience on the trail. She said that it was weird. She used to regularly jog the trail, and she finished it in 20 to 30 minutes. So, we decided to try the trail again with my sister-in-law, and she was right, the trail was short. We finished walking it in an hour, and it looked completely different. There was no huge boulder, no pine trees forming an arch, it was winding and not at all straight. A couple of years ago, my partner and I lived in the rainforest in Victoria, Australia. We lived right at the top of the mountain, with around 40 to 60 kilometers of dense rainforest and extremely winding roads in all directions. We often spent the weekend with friends in Melbourne and would always leave late on a Sunday night, so we often wouldn't get home till around 3 or 4 a.m. This particular night, we were heading home around 3 a.m. It was coming into the winter, so it was extremely cold in the forest. If you picture the trail a drunk snail would leave, that's pretty much the shape of this road. Very winding, straight drops on one side with no protection rail. Huge trees and ferns are everywhere on both sides of the road, creating a canopy above. Stunning, but quite easily dangerous. Because of the cold, parts of the road were covered in mist. We were heading into the thick of it, the middle of the forest and fairly high up the mountain, when we turned a tight corner. The faint mist cleared in our headlights, and we saw a man and a woman on the left side of the road. It is pitch black up there. There are no lights whatsoever except for our headlights. So these people suddenly appeared out of nowhere. They didn't have torches. She looked like she was wearing summer clothes, short shorts and a sleeveless shirt, and man pants and a shirt. She had long blonde hair, and the man was using her hair to drag her up the road in a sort of stumbling half-run walk. They didn't seem to see us at all and didn't react to our headlights suddenly breaking up the darkness. He didn't let go of her hair. It was as if we weren't there. My heart stopped. WTF was this? My partner, who was driving, also exclaimed, "What the duck? How are they there? What are they doing?" We quickly turned another corner, on an extremely winding road, and freaked out. We discussed what to do. We had no phone reception whatsoever. This part of the road was also one lane, which was shared by both directions of traffic, so ducking dangerous and scary, so it would be quite dangerous if we stopped the car. We were really concerned for her safety, but at the same time, things didn't line up. We had seen no broken down cars on the way up. They were wearing summer clothes on an absolutely freezing cold night in dense rainforest, halfway up a mountain. If you were walking that road without torches, you would easily fall to your death, not to mention two-way traffic in a single lane. He was dragging her by her hair. You would think if you were him, if you saw a car, you would quickly put your arm around her waist and act natural or something. They never broke step or even looked at us. Because we had another half hour of driving through this dangerous road before we could stop or have phone reception, we discussed this together. What should we do? How were they even there? Should we turn around? I can't. It was so distressing. We were filled with such guilt, but at the same time, none of it felt right or possible. It was really concerning. We started doubting if we had seen it or not before turning the corner. They were in our view for maybe 5 to 10 seconds before we turned the corner. But we had seen them in front of us as we came up, to the side as we passed, and I glanced and saw them behind us as well. By the time we reached the top of the hill and had reception, we had decided that the whole thing was too weird and not right. It just didn't fit. We decided not to call the police, as we weren't entirely sure that what we saw was real, and the nearest manned police station was around 100 kilometers away. We searched for missing people in the area and found nothing. She kept Googling keywords for the following few weeks and also found nothing. We have occasionally Googled over the years. This happened in 2011, and still haven't come up with anything. My partner and I feel that what we saw was definitely a glitch or ghost. Too much didn't line up. I still carry guilt about it. It was a really distressing experience, and I needed to share. I live in Houston, Texas, and from time to time I work a seasonal haunted house job in the North Houston area called the Haunted Trails. This story takes place quite a few months after the Halloween season, in February, to be precise. So, a few years ago, when I was 21, my dad needed some help being driven across town to a business friend's place. At the time, my father lost his license for a drunk driving incident, so it was up to me to drive him places. All was well and good on the drive over to his friend's home. Nothing remarkable or strange occurred during the ride. It was when I was driving back that things got weird. About a quarter way down the road on Beltway 8, I felt my lungs go numb. Not that I couldn't breathe, mind you, but it felt as if I couldn't feel myself breathe. There was no reason for this, there was no gas leak I could smell in the car or anything. Soon after, everything went pitch black for a split second. I couldn't hear and I couldn't see. As if I blacked out behind the wheel. When I came, I wasn't in my car. But on the side of the road, off Beltway 8, on a street called Antoine Doctor. I knew the street because of where I regained consciousness. It was the haunted trails. Everything was taken down, there were no monster props or scary things to be seen. A few walls and nailed down props were hell. One of the props scared the hell out of me when I snapped out of it. It was dim and cold, and I was unsure as to why I was even there when, not even a second ago, I was behind the wheel of a car going 65 miles an hour on the freeway. I was also confused as to why it was so dim. When I blacked out, it was only 2 p.m. I looked at my phone. 7:24 p.m. I flipped shit. I ran out of that broken down place and to the front of it to find my car was okay and not taken. I was surprised to learn that the car was running that whole time, though. When I stumbled back in, I saw the obvious sight of the gas alert light on and the dial almost empty. So after getting some gas and calling an understandably worried mom, I drove home without further incident. When I got there, I told her what happened, and she couldn't understand it either. Anything could have happened when I was blacked out behind the wheel, all of which should have ended with my death. But no, when I came, there was no damage to the car, myself and the vehicle were parked perfectly, and it was still on and running. I don't have the slightest clue as to how that could be or what happened in that lost time. If anyone has any theories, I'm finally ready to listen. So, I came here because we are absolutely clueless as to what the thing following my fiancé is. I was hoping someone with a little more knowledge than me could help me shed some light on this. Whether it is supernatural or not. My fiancé first encountered this thing in 2013. He and his friends were on a camping trip up in the woods in Maine, in the middle of nowhere, literally. No houses, nothing for miles. They had a small fire going, but due to the rain, it was hard to keep it going. They kept hearing something trying to creep up on them. It was kind of noisy and sounded big, but it was only 2 feet. They started throwing rocks in the direction they heard the footsteps, and suddenly this thing let out a blood-curdling scream, nothing any of them had heard before. He describes it as something that sounds like a fox but is slightly more human. It crashed through the woods super clumsily but kept trying to come back. They had to fend it off most of the night. The second time was about a year and a half later. He was out on a solo camping trip in Vermont, since that was something he enjoyed. He heard the same exact blood-curdling scream he had heard the first time. He was just sitting alone in the dark, looking at the stars with no fire or anything else, when suddenly he heard the scream again. He quickly packed everything up and just went home, no hesitation. The third time was tonight. He was supposed to go out to my car to grab us a couple bottles of water when he heard voices. Due to us recently having someone come onto our property and steal from our landlords, he went to investigate. He calls me and tells me to let the dog out. As he was sneaking around, the voices turned to a snarling sound. He quickly stopped, turned off his flashlight, and dropped to the ground. The dog was standing next to him when suddenly he saw 2 glowing eyes, and it lunged at him. The dog got excited and started chasing it. The whole time they're chasing it, it's screaming and running faster than our dog. Even though he was running with a flashlight, he couldn't make out the shape of its body. He says how far apart the eyes were, making it seem kind of big. He couldn't get a shape or color, besides where its body should be, there was a slight discoloration of the darkness around it. It kept looking back at him while he chased it, and its eyes were just glowing while it screamed. Our dog chased it off into the woods, but luckily she came back. I think it was trying to lure him in by making it sound like voices, but the dog scared it. He said he couldn't get a height because the eye level kept changing from squatting to standing up, and then it started running. Has anyone experienced anything like this? Or who knows what this animal or supernatural thing could be? I have been tempted to share this story for a while now. The following occurred on an island off Washington state about 7 years ago. My sister and her family moved from Oregon to Washington. I tagged along to check it out. It was different there. The woods in Oregon had a welcoming fantasy forest feeling, whereas the woods in Washington felt ominous. Forbidding. Especially at night. You could really feel the woods out there, if that makes sense. It was late afternoon. I was just chilling on the sofa at my sister's new place when she said she found out about a trail on this island. It was already late afternoon, but we said, what the hell? Let's go check it out. Her husband wasn't up for it, but he agreed to drop us off and pick us up after. My oldest niece also decided to go with us. It's about 15 minutes away, so we grab a handful of things, and off we go. We were walking and talking, enjoying the quiet. It was a simple trail, nothing special so far. We get to this enormous tree, which must have been 6 feet around. It's in the middle of where the trail splits off in 2 directions. One that leads towards the seashore and one that leads further into the woods. So we head towards the sea. We hang there for a bit, taking in the view and shooting the breeze, before we start to head back. We get to the big tree, and we decide to check out the other trail leading off into the woods. We're having a nice time. We have the trail entirely to ourselves, and we're laughing and kidding around, enjoying each other's company in this nice day. I don't remember who bought it, but somehow Bigfoot comes up. Jokingly, I pick up a big stick and start whacking it against a random tree on the side of the trail. Instantly, about 20 yards off the trail, before I'm even done with my second tap, a very loud wood rapping sound begins hammering a tree. Fast. When I say fast, I mean death metal blasts that beat fast. And incredibly loud. We can't see anything there, though, and suddenly it stops. We stand there, startled. I think my niece said something about a woodpecker, and we agreed and moved on. From here on, you might say I'm making too much out of nothing. Or that we were idiots. You had to be there. You know the whole the woods went silent thing. Well, they were already quiet. But something had shifted. The atmosphere had changed, and we weren't laughing now. Uneasy. But we kept going and slowly started relaxing and chatting. Then, somewhere up above us between the treetops and the sky, a monkey started screaming. We froze. Everyone knows that sound. It's unmistakable. Wah-ah-ah. Rising higher and higher. Like laughter moving closer and closer, as it passes above us, it seamlessly morphs into a crow cawing. But though we followed the sound as it passed overhead, we didn't see anything. We keep moving. No one says anything. But we silently agree to move back towards the exit. We finish the loop we are on and head back in the direction of the big tree. Instead, we end up with a part we don't recognize. You know where this is going. We spend the next hour or so backtracking and pretending there isn't a seed of panic in our guts. It's getting darker, and the temperature is dropping. We focus on the situation and keep our cool. Finally, up ahead, I see the big tree, and we are all relieved. As we are headed towards it, we hear the children. You know the sound of a big group of kids bursting out of the school doors laughing? Like that. Headed towards the seashore. I was relieved to hear people. We round the big tree and start heading up the main trail towards the exit. My sister calls her husband and tells him to go ahead and come get us. Up ahead of us is a bend, and from around that bend come 2 dogs. One big guy, one little guy. Dragging leashes. They stand there just looking at us, and as we approach the bend, they both turn around and go back. About 20 seconds later, we round that bend, expecting to greet the owners, and there is nothing there. No dogs, no people. It's a straight shot up to the exit from there. The sides of the trail are about 8 feet high and steep. There is nowhere anyone could have gone. That's when I remember the kids. It's getting dark soon. Where are they? Why would a crowd of kids be going to a random, isolated seashore at this time of day? Then it occurred to me that we didn't hear any footsteps. A crowd of kids would have made much more noise. Especially moving at that speed. Also, there were no footprints of anyone but us. Her husband has by then shown up and is waiting with the engine running. Almost there. Right before we exit the gate, a powerful stench of something dead and rotting hits me. I glance up to my left in the direction it's coming from, and I feel a force of pure malevolence shoot right at me. Like nothing I have ever felt in my life. Absolute and passionate hatred is aimed directly at me. My nose and eyes are glued to the spot, but there is nothing there. We get in the car and pull away. And that was it. And that is the part that bothers me most. Because none of us said a thing. As soon as we shut the doors, it was like it never happened. We started talking about dinner and watching a movie, etc. Like nothing had happened. It wasn't until later that night. I was so alone looking at some snapshots I took of the hike that I started to piece them together. On a whim, I messaged my friend Joe, who is into weird stuff, and tell him a short version of the events. He never replied, and I forgot about it. Over a few years and several phones, I never deleted that message. It was like a blank spot, sitting where my memory of it should be. I could only remember it clearly when I reread it. Another strange thing is that both my sister and I are into Bigfoot and 411. Yet we never once discussed it. I picked it up once a couple years ago, something like, "Remember that weird trail we went on?" Her only reply was, "I'll never go on that trail again." And that was that. It never came up again. Hearing a monkey scream in that forest was the most scared I've ever been in my entire adult life. What sticks with me the most is, however, at the end. It was a hatred I can't describe. Just emanating like that stench accompanying it. Just absolute and total hatred. Directed at me. Not my sister. Not my niece. Whatever it was, I wanted to know that it was me. It despised me completely. It would have been there at the finish line, no matter what. So don't stir things up. You aren't and won't be in control. And scariest of all, it ducking hates you. Turkey in the woods. Yesterday, my friend and I arranged to meet at the local nature preserve. It was the warmest day of the year, and we just wanted to hang out outside. This nature preserve is on the outskirts of our town, in a very quiet area, next to a small vegetable farm. It's laid out like this: a long dirt path from the road, no cars or horses allowed. You pass a few large fields with plants and stuff, and the farm is on your right while you walk. The path goes through a large wooded area and wraps around to a small beach. The town is on a bay. It's not dense wood, but it goes on for a long time, and there are small animals and foliage. It's nice. It's very quiet. So we were just walking through the woods. It's April, and it's like 70 degrees, finally, spring weather. My friend is talking, but I just cut him off short and pointed behind him. For some reason, there's something white sitting on the leaves, and it's pretty far away. I really wanted to check it out for some reason, so we went towards it. It's a roast turkey in a white styrofoam box or tray thing. My first thought was an animal trap. It's very weird to use an entire roast turkey, but alright. But we checked for snares, none. I put my hand over the turkey. It's still warm. A few flies buzz around, but that turkey is radiating heat, like it was just pulled out of the oven. And it isn't rotten. It's new. But there's nobody around. We look in the trees and split up to search the area. Nobody. Just a turkey, for no reason. Maybe they wanted to poison the squirrels? But why? In a nature preserve with nobody's property on or around it? And why make a whole turkey? And where did the cook/deliverer go? This happened a few years ago. I was driving through East Pennsylvania, and I'm giving this girl I had just met at a friend's house that night a ride back to her place. Now, getting to her house involves going down a one-lane road that I had driven on at least 100 times prior to this. At one section, the road meanders around a ridge by making a big right turn, then it does a sharp turn left after a couple hundred yards, and then right again where these two logs laying on the side of the road make a kind of X shape on the ground. A very distinctive landmark, at least for me. This is the way this road has always been. So there we are, trying to find topics to talk about to keep the car ride from becoming awkward since we hardly know each other. We take a right turn, round the bend, then a sharp left turn, and then there's a left turn up ahead. Immediately, my body goes into fight or flight mode. I remember thinking, this isn't right, I know there's a right turn here. This is not what is supposed to be here. We both fell dead silent and just looked ahead in confusion. The road about 100 yards in front of me just turned left and disappeared off into the woods. To the right, there was nothing, just the side of a hill and some trees. It looked completely natural, not like a mirage or anything, yet it felt so strange and almost intentionally deceptive. None of this made sense. I knew these roads. As we approached the turn, I decided that I wasn't going down that road, something bad was down that road, so I just made the irrational decision to turn right instead and hope for the best. The girl in the car put her hands on the dashboard to brace for impact. My eyes were still fixated on the left turning road as I started steering to my right, and then as my gaze shifted towards the direction I was now driving in, suddenly I could see the correct road in front of me again. Everything was back to normal. I looked in the rear view mirror, and sure enough, the left turning road was non-existent. My hands felt icy cold, and I was physically shaking. I pulled over to my right and just sat there in silence. We contemplated going back to investigate, but just looking at the road behind me gave me a sick feeling in my stomach. She felt it too. We decided to get the hell out of there, and that was that. I was very hesitant to go down that road again and avoided it the best I could after that, but a few weeks or months later, I decided to go back in the daytime and check it out. I pulled over at the right turn spot, got out of my car, and walked around the area. This is the part that really freaks me out. I quickly found out that on the left side of the road, obscured by some thick underbrush, was a very steep, rocky cliff that dropped off maybe 200 to 250 feet into a ravine. The phantom road would have taken me directly through a clearing in between two trees that lead straight over the cliff. If I had chosen not to follow my gut and drove down that road, there's a very, very good chance that we would have been seriously injured or killed. Apparently several people have crashed in that area by driving down into the ravine. It might just be a coincidence, who knows? I don't know what to make of this event. If I were alone, I'd be more willing to write it off as a hallucination or trick of the eye, but I wasn't alone. She saw the same thing I did. I wasn't intoxicated, although my passenger was a bit buzzed, if I remember correctly. I've also never experienced anything out of the ordinary in my entire life other than this. Has anyone heard of something similar before? These events happened in 2011, and I still don't have a logical explanation. I was doing a year abroad on the south coast of Britain to learn English. We were students between 16 and 18 years old living in host families, so we didn't have much money or anything to do aside from chilling outside or going to the beach in our free time. On Friday afternoon, we met two students from another school at the beach, and they asked us, my best friend and I, if we wanted to join them for a drinking night near their campus tonight. We said yes and invited some of our friends to the evening. Some of us wanted to go home to take a shower or change their clothes, but me, my best friend, and two men from our friend group were living too far, so we decided to go to the park next to the campus and wait there for everyone as the weather was perfect. We didn't know about that place at all. We walked 30 minutes from the beach, following our new friend's instructions. We were staying on a bench in the middle of a big park, and then my best friend and I went for a walk because we needed to pee. We were chatting and laughing. I remember the sky because it was sunset at golden hour. We wanted to explore a little bit of the park because it had a beautiful garden. I remember seeing a green maze and asking my best friend to go there, and nothing else. With my best friend, we woke up at 8:30 a.m. in her bed in her host family's home. We were wearing pajamas and feeling great, and nothing was messy in the room. WTF? We opened Facebook to ask everybody what happened last night, and nobody had an answer. The problem is that we had a reputation for being outgoing and unpredictable, so when they didn't see us coming back, the boys didn't take it seriously and started drinking, not giving a damn about us. Later, other people joined, and everybody thought we were back home. We didn't know the road from the park to her home. Didn't have smartphones or maps. I didn't have money for taxis or public transportation. 10 years later, it still bothers me. We were best friends in England, but we haven't seen each other since. I managed to find her on Instagram and asked her if that's all in my head or if she is also still freaked out by this story. She has no explanation and tries not to think about it anymore. What is your theory? What happened? I experienced this around 2 years ago and never got it off my mind. I'm around 30 years old and a geography teacher in southern Germany. I would say I have my fair share of experience hiking alone in the Alps, because since my childhood, I was almost always hiking there at least once. I managed to do 2 to 3 hikes a year nowadays, around half of them alone, since I moved out and live nearer to the Alps than my friends or family. I even worked in an alpine village or small town for half a year. 2 years ago, I planned a smaller trip in May with just one overnight stay in a cabin. Just for your info, May in the Alps means that there aren't too many people, especially when there are no holidays, because there might still be snow on the peaks and the weather is likely to be bad. The plan was to hike to a self-caterer hut on the first day, do the peak, and ascend on the next day. I planned to pay a nearby alpine inn, sort of a big farm with a restaurant for tourists, a visit in the evening of the first day. The end of the work was at 1300 hours on Tuesday, which gave me enough time to drive from my work to Reutte in the Alps, around a 2-hour drive on the Autobahn. Everything went perfect. The ascent was hard because I had to carry all my stuff to the hut, but without problems. Luckily, the wood for the oven was there already. I already have experience with these huts. They are all mostly the same because they are managed by one central organization, the Alpenverein, so I packed all the things I needed. I probably carried a bit too much stuff. The weather was good, and after I fetched water and put the fire on, around 12°C or 53°F outside, I decided to check out the surroundings and grab something warm to eat at the Alpine Inn. After all, I still had a couple of hours of sunshine left. I climbed on top of the hill above my hut and found a small pond. It was completely filled with newts. I don't know why it was so strange, but I really have had a weird feeling since I saw this pond. I carried my Nikon with me, so I shot the pond, too. I decided to carry on and reached the inn a few minutes later. It was closed down completely, and not a soul was there. It was a bit strange, because according to their homepage, the inn should be open. Well, never mind, I still have my dried noodles and rice, so I went back to my hut, locked the door, and prepared my meal. After I had eaten, I prepared for the night and started to read a book with my flashlight because the sun was already down and it started to rain. Around an hour or so passed and I was ready to sleep, so I checked the fire one last time and noticed it was really cold, too cold for this kind of hut with a fire burning for several hours. Then I noticed the main door. It was open. And I don't mean unlocked, I mean wide open. Key is still in place. It was unsettling. I was really sure I had locked the door. I've lived alone in the city for 7 years, so that's a must. At this moment, I felt really uneasy about the whole situation. But it was too late, too dark, and too much rain to descend now, so I locked the door again and checked if I could open it. Perhaps the lock was faulty. Nope, not a chance. I put as much wood in the oven as possible and went back to bed. Surprisingly, I fell asleep after a while. I can't tell you how long I slept. My smartphone battery died around sunset, but I woke up to a bang. A loud bang. It sounded like someone was kicking at the door. Another bang. I got out of bed and went into the main room. There was nothing to be seen. I checked if one of the window shutters had moved, but they were all fixed in place. I really wished I had done what my mother told me to do and stayed at home at this point. After a few minutes of pondering and rationalizing, I decided to unlock the door. With my hatchet in hand, I peeked outside. As expected, it was pitch black, with no wind and rain pouring down like crazy. I locked the door and checked it at least 3 times. Unsettled, I went back to bed, waited, and listened for new sounds. But nothing occurred. So I decided it was a trick of my mind or rats or something, and I went back to sleep. Then I woke again. I don't know what woke me up, but I know I heard something in that weird phase between being awake and being asleep. My heart was pounding like crazy, and I was wide awake with a ton of adrenaline in my blood. I was 100% sure someone was in the hut. 100%. I pretended to be asleep and waited for them to move to make a sound. I was sure they would talk any moment now. I'm not sure, but I thought I heard something very faint, but it could as well be a trick of the mind. Minutes and minutes passed. And then it was over. It was like a complete shift in tone, like in a video game when all the bad guys are dead, the battle soundtrack stops, and the "It's Just a Normal Day" song starts. I sort of got calmer, and the moment had passed. I whispered hello, but of course no answer followed. After another couple of minutes, I turned on my flashlight and searched the hut. Nothing. I decided to man up and open the main door. I couldn't see my own feet. The whole area was covered in some of the densest fog I have ever seen. I locked the door, got the fire going again, and waited till sunrise. The next morning, I checked the hut from roof to bottom. Nothing unusual. I climbed up the peak, which was still covered by snow, and descended, without visiting the cabin again. Well, that's it. Perhaps I'm just a big sissy, but this experience was so unusual, I had to share it. I don't trust anything I was taught to believe when I was growing up anymore. I grew up in a very rural area and still live in the area now, nearly 40 years later. 20+ minutes from the closest town or store. Only one neighbor is within a mile radius of my home. There are over 15,000 acres in a 10-mile radius around my house that probably haven't had a single person step foot on them in 100 years. This is in Missouri, about an hour west of St. Louis. We should also note that Missouri has countless caves everywhere. I've seen so much that's not supposed to exist over the years. I spent most of my life being a skeptic, and it's almost like life has been ducking with me, calling me an idiot for doing so all those years. I'd see stuff and do everything I could to convince myself that it wasn't real. Not only that, but 99% of the people you try to tell about what happened to you don't believe you. Not only telling you that you are lying, but often ridiculing you over something that was life-shattering. I've had a few life-threatening experiences that people tell me I'm lying about, and I feel like I'm a mother who just had her child kidnapped, but everyone wants to make fun of her and tell her she's lying instead of helping her find her kid. Tesla has a famous quote. When you start drinking from the cup of science, it will make you an atheist, but by the time you get to the bottom of the cup, you will know God exists. I honestly think that describes my life at this point, lol. I have witnessed multiple cryptids, paranormals, voodoo rituals, and more. I don't even think I could even list all my crazy experiences at this point, but I just want to throw some of the major events out there. The first thing to point out is that I have had multiple encounters with the cryptids known as crawlers. My first encounter with one was in the mid-90s. We actually had them slaying all our chickens and even a goat while I was growing up. While I was in high school, I managed to catch one in the bright lights of my pickup truck late one night and got a good minute to look at it about 60 to 70 feet from me while it was on top of our chicken coop, hissing and growling at me. I'm pretty sure my dad managed to shoot one, but we never found the body. Personally, I think they live in the caves that are nearby, north of where I live. A few years ago, I had a crawler stick its head up against the window screen of my bedroom one night while I was playing video games sitting about 5 to 6 feet from the window. I screamed like a woman who just saw her kid killed in front of her. Kind of a cross between a woman and a mountain lion. I fell over in my desk chair, and it hopped away from the window long enough for me to close the window and blinds and grab a gun. 2. The dog man encounters really kind of broke reality for me, which is weird considering everything else I've seen. After I left college years ago, I moved in with my ex-fiancée in St. Louis City for a few years before we broke up and I moved back out to the country. At one point, we bought a house in South City that was over 110 years old. I found it creepy as shit and didn't like it, but my ex loved it for some reason and bought it immediately without my approval. I had to say, though, that I'm glad my name wasn't on the mortgage or title. When we were looking at the house, there was no furniture in it except in the basement. Although the basement was mostly finished, there was a room in the middle of the basement. Actually, it was more of a cage than a room. The floor inside it was unfinished dirt. It had a small child's bed and a dresser in it. They said the furniture came with the house. Just being in that basement gave me dark vibes. I never should have moved in. At night, usually around 3 a.m., you could hear a child crying and sobbing in the basement. Sometimes it was loud enough that I could hear it over the TV upstairs. I would wake up a lot at night only to see a green, glowing ghost dog with red eyes staring at me sitting at the side of the bed. As long as I didn't break eye contact, it would sit there staring at me, but if I closed my eyes and reopened them, it would disappear. Lots of other little weird things happened, like cabinets opening and lights turning off, etc., but in the less than a year I lived there, I probably saw the ghost dog in the middle of the night 50 plus times and heard the kid crying or screaming 200 plus nights. Then, a couple years later, I got a job as a store manager for a gas station chain. I got a store that was right next to an old and big cemetery, surrounded by it on two sides of the property. A few days before I took over the store, the old man who normally worked overnights tripped while walking home and broke his shoulder. He had been out for a month or so. The assistant manager had worked overnight for a day or two before I took over the store. She had an experience that night and called the district manager, telling her she should quit. All I was told at the time was that the district manager had talked her into not quitting but that she was going to go part-time and only work day shifts. So I ended up talking to the assistant manager, who had just stepped down the next day. She told me that she was forced to step down because she refused to work the third shift ever again, and it was required to have 24/7 availability to be a manager. When I asked her why, she said I wouldn't believe her unless she showed me. So we went into the manager's office, and she got on the camera system and showed me video from a few nights earlier. Although the store was open 24/7, they locked it up from 1:30 a.m. to 4:30 a.m. and had a window you could purchase stuff from during those hours. During this time, she was back in the cooler, stocking the cooler. The store was completely locked up, and she was the only person in the store. What I saw next was amazing. They had an end cap near the front door, and as you came in with lots of little gifts and collectibles, on the top shelf were porcelain Indian dolls. I watched as one rose up a few feet in the air and then suddenly flew across the room, smashing against the back wall of the store, almost 20 to 30 feet away. Along with her coming out of the cooler and trying to figure out what happened, I had to work the overnight shift that night too, because we didn't have anyone else. Although I never had anything like that happen the few times I had to work overnight there, I would see stuff moving around inside the store a lot while I was working in the cooler during those locked up hours, but I never saw anything besides what I thought were shadows and reflections. I have had a lot more experiences over the years, these are just the ones I can 100% claim I know are real. Although my stories don't have much to do with Miss 411, it has given me the ability to believe that whatever is causing a lot of these disappearances could be supernatural in nature. I honestly believe the crawlers to be somewhat demonic in nature. For many years, I actually thought it was ghouls I was seeing. The first time I saw that forest ghoul trail cam picture, I freaked out because of how similar it was. They seemed to be incredibly violent and killed just to kill. I also believe, from their looks, that they are a subterranean species. Their pale, almost transparent skin and black eyes just scream to me that they are something that doesn't spend any time in the sun. I know some people on here joke about Bigfoot being the reason, but I just want to let people know that Bigfoot are not the only cryptids out there and that they actually seem like some of the less violent ones in the world. After all this, let's just say it's made it impossible for me to be a blind sheep anymore. I will preface this by saying that my mom died of cancer 4 years after this incident, so this isn't an urgent medical mystery, just something to think about. I believe it sheds some light on how intelligent people can go missing and become disoriented on familiar trails. To set the scene, this took place at a local, county-run, park with lots of hiking and walking trails in the woods. This park directly connects to a U.S. national park, so lots of people will hike along the 3-mile connecting trail and walk between the parks. The county park is popular, has plenty of trails in good condition, and is thus well attended, especially in warm weather. These parks are also popular in the region because they are pretty much surrounded by ever-encroaching suburbia, though 100 years ago, this was a rural area. I was 13 years old at the time, and my mom was 55. This took place about 10 years ago. My mom and I went walking one summer afternoon on a trail we knew well. We had both taken it numerous times in the past 8 to 10 years, whether together, alone, or with other people. It was still daylight, but the sun had begun to approach the horizon. We had just reached the top of a small or medium-sized hill and were probably not walking too fast at the moment when my mom just stopped walking. She had turned and was looking to our right, where the view was a bunch of tall, skinny trees through which one could see the low late afternoon sun. Looking at this area while walking would probably have created a strobe effect with the bright sunlight as the many narrow trees passed between the sun and a person's eyes. So there she was, standing still, facing the trees off the side of the trail. She didn't respond at all to me talking to her, waving my hand in front of her, trying to look into her eyes, or poking her. This was quite worrying to 13-year-old me, who still depended on her for a lot. Before long, she sat down on the ground. This was a controlled movement, she didn't just fall, but she still wasn't reacting to me. The seated position she took, in the middle of the trail, reminded me of how a child would sit, similar to crisscross applesauce, so my 13-year-old mind wondered if she was somehow reverting to childhood. Her eyes remained open the whole time. I managed to get her cell phone, it was either in her hand or pocket, and she didn't react to my attempt to take it, and I called my dad's office. He didn't pick up, as he was likely busy at the time. I decided that if the situation didn't change, I would call him back in about 10 minutes and leave a message on the line that paged his beeper. At this point, I started praying for my mom. After a few minutes, she became responsive again. She knew who I was and didn't panic at the situation. I think she may have been reluctant to get up or get moving, but we started walking again. I couldn't get any clear answers from her regarding what happened. About 5 minutes later, we came to the point where the trail we needed to take, to complete our loop and get back to our car, was a branch off of the straight trail we were on. I took this branch, but she just kept going straight. I had to run back after her and make her come to the correct trail. She said that she didn't know what was the right way and asked me to properly guide her. We had never gone straight on that trail, so she was definitely disoriented. If I hadn't been with her that day, and she frequently went this way by herself, she would have wound up somewhere unfamiliar, and I don't know what she would have done when or if she became fully lucid again. She probably would have called someone on her phone, but that still may not have guaranteed she would find her way home. We got back to the car, and she managed to drive us home. Before long, she was fully lucid and back to normal, and to my knowledge, this kind of situation never recurred. When I brought it up to her once or twice at points afterwards, she dismissed the situation as just caused by the light coming through the trees. I don't know how she perceived the incident or how she remembered it. The whole experience was rather unsettling for 13-year-old me, who'd never had to help my parents like this before. I realized that this had been somewhat similar to a briefer incident that had occurred at the grocery store within the year before the woods incident. When we took our full cart out of the store at the end of the shopping trip, she dazedly began pushing it towards the main road rather than the parking lot. I had to get her to turn in the correct direction. She was somewhat disoriented, but she managed to drive home fine. Later, she remarked how she couldn't believe she had been able to drive in that condition. Indeed, she referenced this incident more than the longer woods incident. I want to tell you about something that happened to me more than 20 years ago, in 1996. This happened in Crimea, Ukraine, and Russia. I went there with my friends. There were 4 of us, we were all students in our early 20s. Our plan was simple, to spend 2 weeks swimming and sunbathing. Also, we wanted to make 1 to 2 short hikes in the mountains. Our hike destination was informally called the Valley of Ghosts. The valley is famous locally for its unique landscape, with rocks weathered by erosion and shaped like statues of people or animals. Also, locals think that it is an anomalous zone where lots of UFO sightings took place, but I don't know if any missing cases were documented. We planned for a 2-day hike. We started early and at a slow pace. The mountain is not high, and you do not need any special equipment to ascend. There are established hiking trails, and usually many tourists are going through the route. Our plan was to reach the plateau on the first day, spend a night there, then in the morning start hiking all the way through towards the waterfalls and descend there, making this an easy hike. The way up was easy, the scenery was beautiful, stone statues were impressive, and the overall atmosphere was very peaceful. We set up camp, had dinner, and went to sleep. We didn't pack any tents with us, just sleeping bags, so we spent the night under the stars. The night was clear, but closer to sunrise, I woke up because the weather started to change and it began raining slightly. I remember vividly that it was that moment when I realized that I did not want to continue the hike. Maybe I just wanted to descend as soon as possible, or maybe I was tired or was anticipating that the weather would get even worse. Anyhow, after breakfast, I told my friends that I would not go any further with them and would go back to our rented apartment. Of course, I had to come up with something more convincing than I just don't want to go. I do not remember the reason I told my friends, but we split our ways lightheartedly. They went on their trail through the plateau, and I started the descent. As soon as I began walking down, the weather became much worse. Dense fog descended rapidly, and I was truly shocked at how it had covered everything around me instantly. I couldn't see more than 10 meters, 30 feet, in front of me. Since I was walking on the trail, I was pretty confident that if I followed it, everything would be okay. But as soon as the fog covered everything around me, weird things began to happen. First, I started hearing the voices. It was like a distant whispering or mumbling. I couldn't decipher any coherent words. Those voices seemed to be different in tone, as if there were people of different ages and sexes. Some sounds were almost non-human. These sounds were unfamiliar and eerie. I was feeling that someone was watching me. At this point, I became a bit frightened and concerned, but soon enough, I saw that there was someone walking towards me. I was so happy and relieved. It looked like a silhouette of a man with a dog on the same trail that I was walking. Since at that moment I started to suspect that I might have taken the wrong path, I wanted to ask directions and how long it would take to go down. And just as I increased my pace towards my savior, the man in front of me started to vanish. At first, I thought there was some rock, tree, or bush at that place that I mistakenly took for a human with a dog, but when I reached the spot where I saw them, I realized that there was absolutely nothing that I could have mistaken for a figure, no rock formations, no trees or bushes. Nothing, just fog. Needless to say, I was freaking out. Bracing myself, I continued along the trail and, after some time, noticed that the whispering was gone. I did not hear it any longer. After 10 minutes or so, the trail began to go down the hill, and soon, hallelujah, I was out of the fog. Damn, was I happy not to be surrounded by that freaky fog anymore? And that uncomfortable feeling of being watched disappeared right after I came out of the fog. I looked down the trail as it was going through the hills, and I felt so relieved. I was already anticipating a very welcome exit. So I started my happy descent. As I was walking down, I spotted the small hill with dried up grass in front of me. It looked like I was going on the right path along the trail. But when I reached this spot, this hill covered with dried up grass, the odd and unsettling feeling of being tricked dawned on me. I clearly realized that this trail on that hill was fake. I couldn't have made the wrong turn, and I couldn't have missed anything. There was only one straight road with no turns. I just knew that this hill was not the real one, as if someone or something had switched off the path while I was walking. I was truly certain that something was wrong. I double-checked the route. The road looked quite normal, nothing out of the ordinary, a clear ground pathway with very few rocks, maybe 2 to 3 feet wide, so I continued to go along. But as I was walking further and further, I noticed that the path under my feet was becoming less visible with each step. I stopped and decided to turn back, thinking that maybe that was the wrong path. However, I couldn't find any traces of the path that I was taking minutes ago. I was frantically searching for the path for maybe half an hour and found absolutely no traces of it, none. I was in the mountains, and it was just rocks and some scarce shrubs and plucks of dry grass. That's it. As if I were teleported there and didn't walk on a clear path minutes ago. I was terrified, but I tried my best not to give in to panic. I was determined to get down. I felt that I needed to go down as quickly as possible, otherwise, I would perish. I knew that the only way down was to climb the rocks, so I started to scramble down. I can honestly say that it was really hard. There was no trail, and I had no equipment. I literally had to crawl down, clutching onto anything I could hold on to, bumps of mud, rocks, batches of grass. A couple of times I had to turn back because of the cliffs, which gave me zero chance of passing through without falling. Frustrated and tired after what seemed like endless hours of descent, I started screaming for help, although I knew that there would be no one in the mountains in this kind of weather. However, I managed to brace myself, and after probably one more hour of descent, I saw the ground below, and then, finally, I found myself at the foothills of the mountain. Now I was all over for real, now I was safe at last. During all my descents, I had this feeling that I had to go down as fast as I could and that if I stayed there a bit longer, I would never go back. Not that I was lost or afraid, that too, but those feelings were in the background. It was as if I literally had a limited amount of time to get out of this mountain, or I'd be a goner. I returned to our rented apartment, and 10 to 15 minutes later, my friends came back too. It turned out that they were also spooked by the weather and decided to go back to the apartment. They turned back 15 to 20 minutes after I left them. And yet they didn't see any fog or hear any whispering on the way down, and they returned via the same trail that we hiked the day before, and it was very clear. So their descent was very quick. What puzzles me is that I really felt like I had spent a lot of time wandering in the mountains, at least 3 to 4 hours, and yet I returned just 15 minutes before my friends. I live in the rural Midwest. I'm uncomfortable sharing my state or county, but I just know the population around here is low. It's mostly just farm towns around here, and I live in one. A short walk from my house, there is a trail I've been walking down for most of my life. It's very shaded with trees, and the actual dirt path is pretty beaten up and hard to stay on if you don't know the land like I do. Almost 2 years ago, I was walking the trail at around 9 a.m. to get some fresh air before I had to go to work like I usually do. I typically walk about halfway down to sit at a small creek, which is roughly 15 to 20 minutes away from where I live if you're walking. I am 100% certain I walk the same way I always do. Straight until you see the trail marker, which is a stump with some orange spray paint on the bottom. At the marker, I always turn left to get to the creek. I cannot stress enough how many times I've done this exact walk in my life. The problem was that when I turned left into the creek where it was supposed to be, it wasn't there. In its place, there was a really run-down white house that looked like it had been rotting there for decades. The place was huge, like a plantation house, but I don't live in the South. I had never felt so confused in my life. I turned around almost immediately to make sure I was at the right trail marker, and sure enough, I was. I looked back at the house again and just stared. For every walk I had been on in these exact woods, I had never seen this place. It didn't make any sense. The place was absolutely huge. I pulled out my phone to try and take a picture, but no matter how much I messed with the power button, the screen would only flicker on for a few seconds and then go back to black. This freaked me out, and I tried to do a force restart, but still nothing happened, so I just pocketed it. I ended up deciding I was going to go inside and check it out, probably a stupid idea in hindsight, but I was too curious to leave. As soon as I walked in, the first thing I noticed was that it was deathly cold in there. It was like walking into a fridge, and it didn't do anything to calm my nerves. Looking around, the main room was nearly empty except for a desk all the way to the back left. There was a laptop on the desk that was open to what looked like a Windows home screen. This worried me because I thought I had just walked in on some squatter's place, and I didn't have anything to defend myself with other than my phone, which wouldn't turn on. To my right, there was a low electric buzzing coming from a cracked door. I walked over to it with my hands around myself because of the freezing cold. I peek inside and see 2 very tall men in lab coats inside, flipping through a notepad with light blue pages. The man on the left is holding. When I tell you that they were very tall, I mean it. Probably like 7 feet, and that wasn't even the weirdest thing about them. They were both pale and blonde and identical down to the shoes. They both had matching big white eyes with pinpricks for pupils. The eyes were unfocused, like they weren't even trying to look at the paper, and it was very unsettling. Once the one on the left flipped a certain page, they both started murmuring. It sounded like they were talking over each other very fast, and I only caught some words. I think they kept talking about metamorphosis and hitting their long fingers against the paper like they were pointing. They kept mumbling in barely coherent English and nodding while making sounds like ooh and mhm. I didn't get to hear much because the door creaked as I leaned on it by mistake, and they immediately went silent and whipped their heads in my direction so fast I could have sworn I heard a crack. Their pupils weirdly twitched into place to look at me, and I freaked the duck out. I screamed and bolted back for the front door. When I was running back, I hit something face first, fell onto my ass, and dropped my phone before I could get to the door. It felt like I just got a face full of fabric, and when I managed to scramble to my feet, it was another one of the men in the lab coats. He was identical to the other 2, and his pupils also did that weird thing to look at me. I shoved him away from me, and he sort of folded inward like he had no spine or chest bones before hitting the floor. I ran out the door and towards my home, never stopping for a second, even though I didn't hear anyone following me. I ended up just running all the way to work, and when I made it, I saw my coworker, whom we'll call Adam for the sake of privacy. Adam could see that I was shaken, and I explained the story to him, still freaking the duck out and almost crying. He listened to the whole thing and kept asking me if I was sure it wasn't just a dream, and I insisted it wasn't. I even told him that I lost my phone there and needed to get it back. Adam told me that he'd go back with me after work to get it, and I agreed. I went through the whole workday still anxious, and then I went with Adam down the path. We took the same way I had walked this morning, I'm absolutely sure of it, and when we got to the stump and turned, I could not believe my eyes. There was no house there anymore, it was the creek again, and I could see my phone sitting in a small patch of wet grass. I felt like I was going to throw up as I explained to Adam that there was a house right here earlier today and that I wasn't crazy. Adam just grabbed my phone from the wet grass and handed it to me. He put his hand on my shoulder and directed me away from the creek. I kept trying to explain it to him, and eventually he stopped me. He told me he understood and that things like that just happen around here. I tried to push him to say what he meant, but he remained silent until he had to say goodbye at my doorstep. I work somewhere different now, but I still text Adam. When I try to ask him about that day, he confirms that he found my phone there, and he saw firsthand how genuinely shaken I was. But he won't elaborate on what he meant by things like that just happen around here. No matter how much I push. I still live there, and I still go on walks. I've never seen the house again, not even one like it anywhere near here, even when going off the trail. I still think about this event and get freaked out. There was something distinctly inhuman about the men I saw, and I don't know how a whole house could simply appear and reappear. The only explanation I can come up with is that maybe I fell asleep at home before work and dreamed it all, but it felt so real. And that does not account for why my phone was actually at the creek when I went back. So when I was 10, I was over at my cousin Gwen's house. She was also 10. It was a hot June day, and it was about 9 a.m. when we decided we wanted to go play in the woods. It was not abnormal for us, we loved being outside. For context, she lives down a private lane with 7 other houses, all inhabited by older people. She was the only child, along with her older brother, who lived down this lane. It's also a really historical area where a train used to come through, and although the tracks are gone, you can see in her yard where they would have been. Her house is also an old factory that soldiers used to stay at during the Civil War. I've had a lot of creepy encounters inside that house, but that's a story for another day. Today is about those damn woods. The entrance to the woods is across the road from her house, like 20 feet from the driveway. No cars can get into the woods. That'll be important later. We had played in these woods so many times, and it's an isolated section where, on a normal day, if you walk 20 minutes in any direction, you're going to hit the road, someone's yard, or a development of McMansions. We follow the usual path into the woods and come across a Y intersection. We had been to this part many times before, we've walked the dogs here, gone on walks with my aunt, and played together. Normal stuff. To the left of the Y intersection is a stream you cross, and on the other side of the stream, the path continues around a bend. To the right of the Y, it leads you deeper into the woods. We saw the footprints of big boots in the mud across the stream and wanted to follow them. So we did. Gwen and I crossed the stream and come around the bend, as we have many times before. But this time, we see a gravel driveway leading up to an old cabin. There's an old woman sweeping the porch and a man standing 20 feet from us next to an old pickup truck. Like from the 50s. The man had a blonde buzz cut, he's tall, probably 6 feet 5 inches, and wearing a white wife beater, light blue cropped denim shorts, and large boots covered in mud. I'll never forget his outfit. It was very unusual for me to see a man wearing shorts that short. This was like 06 to 07. The woman points at my cousin and me, and the man turns around and starts chasing us. We run away, cross the stream, and then come to a stop at the Y. We didn't even look to see if the man was still chasing us. We felt surprisingly calm and happy about what just happened. Keep in mind that my cousin and I have talked about what happened so many times, and we always ask why we weren't scared about being chased, so, Gwen and I push forward, follow the right trail, and go further into the woods. Marching on, the path in the woods turns from a wide, easy walkway to intricate pathways. I mean, it looked like someone perfectly measured the height of the grass, the picking bushes were neatly kempt. The pathway was narrow. I remember at that point, the air had this beautiful golden glow to it, and everything looked so crisp, with drops of dew. And I felt so happy and was having the best time. I was calm. We found a box turtle on the pathway and carried him with us. This is where it gets really weird for me, and I actually get emotional when I tell this in person because it's just so weird to know I saw this. The pathway turned into a hallway, a perfectly squared out hallway, with a wall and ceiling of vines and bark that were pressed together so tightly you couldn't see through it. Yet there was still light. A glow. A purple yet golden glow. It looked misty. And the grass was taller here, maybe a little above my ankle, and I remember it felt like silk touching my leg. The hallway opened up into a perfectly square room. Once again, with covered walls and ceilings and the perfect silky grass. The hallway we came in from was on the left, and there was another hallway leading out on the opposite wall on the right. And on the right-hand side of the room was an old pickup truck. I remember it as red, Gwen remembers it as white. It was running. All the lights were on, all the doors were open, and the bed of the truck was open. The bed of the truck had long wooden planks and black trash bags full of, well, I don't know what was in them. So, like any normal 10-year-old, we climbed into the bed of the truck with the turtle and played there for a while. I remember watching the turtle scooting across the planks, and Gwen and I were laying on the trash bags as if they were bean bags. It is so odd for me to think that we did that. Both of us were anxious children. I'll just never forget the way the room felt. And how it looked, and I didn't think it was off at the time. I mean, it was straight out of Alice in Wonderland. Or Dr. Seuss. Gwen and I get out of the truck with our turtle and exit the room on the other side. Neither of us really remember walking along the trails, we don't remember what we talked about, we just remember the big things that happened that day. I do remember at this point we dropped our turtle friend off, the pathways had gone back to normal, with cropped grass, kempt bushes, the golden glow, and dew-covered shrubbery. We come across a wooden sign that is painted in black capital letters Luke's Trail. And the arrow pointed further down the path. We both remember being really excited and saying things like, "We have to find Luke." So we follow the trail, and all of a sudden we are in a very open patch of the woods. Like a big circle surrounded by trees and shrubbery. But the earth we were standing on was just dirt, no grass. We had no idea what direction we even came from. And it finally hit us. Where the hell were we? How long had we been in the woods? It felt like everything was spinning even though I wasn't moving, and everything got so loud, like birds screeching. I even heard what I thought were cars driving by but couldn't see a road. All of a sudden, it went dead silent. Gwen saw a giant bird-like creature fly out of the trees above us. She said it looked like a dinosaur. I didn't see it, but I saw its shadow. And after that, we don't remember anything. All of a sudden we were walking out of the woods, the sun was setting, and we were walking up to her mom's doorstep. We both reached to grab the door, and in that moment, we looked at each other and started freaking out. Screaming, how did we get home? What the hell happened back there? As if all the odd events finally hit us. Like, that was really weird, and why didn't we find it weird? We walked inside, crying. We told my sister and her brother everything that happened through tears. They accused us of lying, of course, my sister believes me, she said she regrets not coming with us that day. Also, when we got back, it was 7 at night. We were gone for 10 hours. I'm a 24-year-old woman and an active hiker, and 20 minutes into every hike, I'm dying for water and a snack. I have gone back with Gwen so many times to find out what happened in hell. We have covered every square inch of that place and nothing else. Not a single clue. The weird part? Later that summer, back at my house, my sister and my other 2 cousins, Tyler and Mikey, were playing in the cornfield that surrounded my house. We rented in an extremely rural area and lived at a house at the bottom of the hill, and at the top was the family from whom we rented. They were farmers, and they planted crops all around us. So we watched this corn grow. We're running through the cornfield, and all of a sudden we hit an open patch. In the middle of this open spot is an old pickup truck. Running with all the lights on and all the doors open. I don't remember if there was anything in the bed of the truck because I screamed, and we all ran home terrified. I mean, there was no way for that truck to have gotten in there unless a helicopter planted it there. There were no pathways for it to drive into. So yeah, that's my story. I'd love to hear your input, I just wanted to be as detailed as I could. Personally, what I think happened was that we went through a portal. To another dimension, another reality, a spirit world, I don't know. But we went through a portal. I saw the other side. I know I did. And every day, I am so fortunate to have made my way back home. I grew up in a small Welsh village in the UK called Llanrumney. Our school was sort of on the outskirts of the village, closer to the city of Cardiff. Every morning, me and a friend would walk to school, but boys being boys, we'd try and find the most pointless, longest, and possibly most dangerous route to school possible. This ended up with us entering the woods via a public footpath, then leaving the path and walking through the forest, following the Rumney River. In the early mornings around winter, I remember the river would always have this eerie mist along its banks, which added to the creepy atmosphere. So there we were, 2 school lads in their Harry Potter-style uniforms following a river to school, when suddenly my friend stopped in his tracks and put his hand up to stop me from walking into him. When I followed his gaze off to the right in the river, I saw it. Do you ever see something your mind, even at 11, knows should not be there? I just stayed perfectly still for what felt like hours, just watching this creature plunge its huge beak into the rushing water, then rotating its giant head back to his wings. This was a bird that was bigger than anything I'd seen on my annual school trips to the zoo. Think of the largest dog you've seen. You probably think something along the lines of a Great Dane. Well, imagine that, but twice as big. After a few more minutes of watching this thing bathe, me and my friend quietly walked away, leaving it in the river. We saw it often, at the exact same time, in the exact same spot every day. We didn't tell many people about it because whenever we did and they'd walk to school with us, it was never there. So naturally, our friends thought we were making it all up. I saw it one last time, in the summer of 1997. I was walking to school by myself, and this time I didn't just see it clean, I saw this thing take off. I have to tell you, when you see a bird that size flex its wingspan, I genuinely feel a little scared. But that's it. I never saw it again, and I and my friend have never really spoken about it, but I'll always remember it. Obviously, over the years I've done research trying to locate the breed of this bird, but I've never been able to find what I saw. The story I'm about to tell is just one of many that I've experienced. I think the surplus of weird occurrences that have happened to me are largely related to the area in which I live. This whole collection of counties and small disjointed towns is riddled with the creepy, supernatural, and just plain unexplainable, though why, I couldn't say. Maybe because I live in South Carolina, which we all know is the home of many, many wars. War has nothing to do with some of the things that I've seen. I want to tell you about one of the most prominent things I've seen. One of those situations wasn't just seeing a man in grease covered on the side of the road, miles from the nearest building, staring into the woods at 3 a.m, his flashlight pointed into acres and acres of trees, unmoving. One that can't just be brushed off as something a little weird but forgettable. I want to tell you about the time the woods held my friends and me captive for hours. It started as an average day on a small farm-like chunk of land that my friend's mother owned. My friends and I were 3 healthy young boys, and thus we were responsible for doing some of the heavier jobs around the little farm. We did things like dig trenches, put up fences, and clear the land of stumps or fallen limbs. These were obviously trying tasks, so when we were offered an easier job, we were very keen on taking it. We were to take 4 buckets out into the woods and search for good soil to pot some vegetables in. The dirt from the farm itself couldn't be used because it either already held vegetables or was part of the goat pen and wouldn't grow things well. My friend had grown up on this land and was very familiar with the expanse of woods behind his home. He had played in it as a child, and his father regularly went deer hunting there. I didn't figure that there was any way we'd get lost, no matter how far we went. I was horribly wrong. At the mouth of the woods was a thick, green section taller than all of our heads. It was so thick, in fact, that we opted to bring a machete so that we could widen the path as we went. It seemed like the only thing that had been down that way in years were deer, and at first I thought the idea of trudging down forgotten paths was sort of exciting and adventurous. The feeling only heightened when we came out of this green tunnel of a path and were faced with an old shed. Inside, the shed was filled with nothing but old newspapers, the latest of which was dated something in 1982, and giant blocks of dried artist clay. My friend told us that his family had no idea who had owned the shed, but that it hadn't been touched since before he was born, and that it was sort of his starting point for each path he had made deeper into the woods. Supposedly, if we were to backtrack on any of the paths ahead, we would come back to the shed eventually. I later found out that was a lie. We started down the path that looked like it would lead to the most fertile section of woods. Since leaving the green tunnel, the woods have opened up and are exceptionally spacious. There were several feet between each tree, and we could see what seemed to be miles ahead of us. The dirt here was dry and thick with clay, so we decided to continue forward. The large section we were in ended rather suddenly at a creek, and the opposite bank was up over our heads by a couple feet. Since we couldn't cross it easily, we decided that we'd go downstream a bit to see if there was a low point that we could cross. I remember feeling at this point like I was in the middle of the line and that one of my friends was walking closely behind me, but I could see both of them straight ahead. I didn't think much of it at that time, deciding that I was just a little uneasy being surrounded so closely by so many trees, but later on it would prove much more significant. By the time we found a spot where we could get across, the trees had gotten closer together, and there was a bit less light flooding down from above. Everything at our level was dead and dry from the way that the trees hogged the sunlight, leaving it cold and barren despite the close proximity of so many twisted trunks. We quickly crossed the creek and headed back down, wanting to get back to the point where we had originally wanted to cross and head straight out from there. However, we never made it to that point. Instead, we came to a barbed wire fence. It was old, rusted, and falling down in some spots, but it was still erect enough to block our path. My friend said it was weird and that he didn't remember there being a fence coming straight off of the creek like that. After all, it wasn't like there were any property lines this far into the woods. We shrugged it off and hopped the fence carefully, still trying to make it back to the original path. The feeling of someone walking behind me grew stronger after crossing the fence, and at some point I realized that I could hear the sound of bells every once in a while, almost as if someone had been walking with bells tied around their ankles. Again, I ignored this. I was starting to get a little tired and weary by this point. We had been gone for almost an hour and had yet to find any dirt worthwhile. We were very far into the forest, and being as terrible at directions as I am, I was a little worried we wouldn't be able to find our way back. My friends assured me that they remembered which way we came from, but I was skeptical. I asked them, weren't we supposed to be following the creek? They were fairly shocked. None of us had realized that some time ago, we had wandered away from the creek and were now just walking aimlessly forward. We searched as hard as we could for any signs of the creek in the distance without actually walking any farther away, but we couldn't find it through the thick trees. My friend decided that we should backtrack until we came to the creek again. It couldn't be too hard to find, since it had cut our path in half before and gone on for miles in both directions. With our buckets still devoid of the dirt we had come searching for, we turned back and headed for the creek. We walked on for 5 minutes or so. Then 10. Then stopped. We were at the barbed wire fence again, but this time, there was no creek at its end. After following it for another 10 minutes, we realized that there was no end in sight and that we were probably walking in the wrong direction. We decided to hop it again and go back the opposite way. After 5 minutes, we had lost the fence. None of us could remember walking away from it, but just like the creek before it, it had disappeared into the foliage. We were all terribly unsettled by this point, but keeping our heads about us, we moved on back in the direction we thought was home. Our path was as straight as we could make it, and my friend assured us that we were headed back towards the creek we had first passed, but I was doubtful. Especially when we came to yet another fence. We didn't question it this time and just hopped on it and continued forward. We were too frightened to think about it. I know it doesn't seem very frightening at this point, the fact that we've just gotten mixed around a little in the woods and only been out for about 2 hours, but we were horrified. None of us spoke as we walked. We were too focused on making sure we went straight back the way we came. What we came to next is where things took a turn for the unnatural. There was a bright clearing up ahead, and although it was a bit to the right of our path, we decided to pass through it anyway. It seemed open there, and we were all a bit claustrophobic by then, unable to breathe amongst the insufferable trees. And yet, when we got there, we found that it wasn't a clearing at all. It was only about 6 feet around in all directions, with trees at its edges and a few fallen limbs surrounding it. The ground was peppered with moss and very soft beneath our feet. Tired, my friends decided to lay down for a bit on the cushioned ground and catch their breath. I decided that this dirt was soft enough and seemed pretty fertile, so I set to work filling our buckets with as much as I could. That's when my friends suddenly started calling to me in frantic voices. They were both very worked up about this fallen limb at the edge of the little space. At first, it seemed pretty mundane, but upon closer inspection, I noticed several things wrong with it. Firstly, it was perfectly horizontal. It was a good 1.5 feet from the ground at both the left and right ends, and as straight as an arrow. Secondly, it was solid white. My 2 friends were lying beneath it, looking up at its underside with what I could only imagine was wonderment. Curious, I slid down on my back and wiggled under it, looking up at the solid white wood. There were markings on it. Not the curved, organic lines found under the bark of most trees, or even the deep shallow markings of beetles who had come and gone. No, these were separated out, meticulously planned. It looked, in all honesty, like writing or sigils. Somehow, I wasn't scared. I remember feeling in awe, like I had come across some religious artifact and that I was blessed to be in its presence. I reached up, and I touched the wood, finding it soft beneath my fingers. It was easily scratched, and I realized how the marking had been made. Intrigued, I made the stupidest decision I've ever made. I wrote my name on it. In the back of my mind, I could hear the tinkling of bells tied around my ankles. We left the clearing only a few minutes later, still almost high on some sort of imagined enlightenment, but that emotion was soon to fade. The farther we got from the bright little clearing, the more we realized how wrong it had been. It wasn't natural. Things like that didn't just exist in the woods. Our fear returned full blast. Finally, we came back to the creek that we had crossed nearly 3 hours ago. We were immediately relieved. Now, we figured we could find the path and head back home in no time. It took us another 15 minutes to find what we believed was the path and start backtracking again. We walked fast, eager to leave the woods. The sound of bells and the feeling of someone behind me grew strong enough that I asked to walk in the middle of the line, putting my friend behind me. Another 10 minutes passed, and we came to a creek. Not the same creek as before. A new one, with shallower banks and stagnant water. We were petrified. There had been no second creek. Not on the path, not in the open woods, not anywhere. How had we come to this? I broke down and started crying. My friend decided it was time to call for help and pulled out his phone to call his dad. His dad was angry with us for getting lost, but he told us to find a trail and stick to it while he came to look for us. He was going to bring a shotgun and fire it along the way so we could try to follow the sound to him. The first shot was fired from the house. We heard it pretty clearly, but it was in the opposite direction we'd been heading. We were confused, but at this point it wasn't surprising, and we turned around and began to follow it back. 5 minutes passed before we heard another shot, and again, it came from behind us. We didn't know what to do. We had been following it straight on this whole time, and we were certain we hadn't been turned around. There was no way his dad had gone from the house to the opposite side of the woods in only 5 minutes. We decided to stay where we were and wait for the next gunshot. 5 more minutes passed, and it came again. It was pretty close to us, and we were sure of the direction this time, so we headed quickly towards it. Not a full minute passed before there was a third shot from 500 feet behind us. Our heads snapped around, and we nearly hit the ground. Just behind us, we could see a figure moving around through the foliage, just far out enough to be completely obscured, but still, it was recognizable as a human silhouette. We assumed it was my friend's dad and headed back towards it now. Another gunshot, 500 feet behind us, sounded about a minute later. Now there were two silhouettes. They were at equal distances from us on the left and right. They both moved closer at the same pace. Absolutely terrified and unable to tell which, if either, was his father, we all ducked down and hid from the figures in the distance. Another gunshot was fired, this one from the first figure. It was close enough to sting my ears, and, blessedly, it was the last shot fired. No echoing shot came from behind us. When his father reached us and we stood up, the second figure was gone. Stuttering, we asked him who had been firing the second shot, and he couldn't give us an answer. He had heard no other shots. He was the only one who had come to look for us. Again, I wanted to cry, but I held back this time. I focused on the fact that we were headed home now and that this would be over soon. This man had been hunting in these woods every year and had found us in only 40 minutes, give or take, so there was no doubt we would find our way back soon. We were gone for almost another hour. Even after finding the marked hunting trails, we had trouble finding our way back. My friend's dad began to grow more and more perplexed as to how he had gotten lost so quickly, but he refused to admit he didn't know where we were. Maybe his refusal to give in is what eventually got us out of the woods, or maybe there was no reasoning at all for how we finally escaped. All I know is that when we did, the mysteries only thickened. We had been walking for 4 to 5 hours. The time only registered 2 hours later than when we left. Also, we emerged in the parking lot behind a church. The church in question was across 2 roads that we hadn't crossed. Somehow, the woods spit us out in the opposite direction from which we had entered, 2 roads away from my friend's home, and we had eaten for several hours only to return them when we were free. As we drove away, I heard one last tinkling bell sound and had the feeling that something had stopped at the edge of the woods. I was watching as we left. And, as the piece de resistance to this story, there's one final detail. I had been wearing a necklace almost every day for the past year or so, and it had been around my neck when we entered the woods. By the time we left, it was missing, and I assumed it had fallen off. I was upset, yes, but I knew there was no way I was going to get it back. A couple of weeks later, I returned to my friend's house. I was in the back, out at the edge of the woods where the pig stayed, and I caught a glimpse of something on the ground. My necklace lay at the edge of the woods, right in the center of the path we had first taken. I later buried the necklace and have not gone back for it since.